This is Bonjour Chai, the It's Not Easy Being Blue and White Either edition. I'm Avi Finegold in Montreal, and I'm here with Melissa Lantsman in Toronto and Ilana Zackon in Vancouver. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's episode, we will discuss a provocative essay by Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy, and we will have a conversation with Pierre Anctil about Jews and Quebec nationalism. How are you guys? What's been happening?
It's very hot in Vancouver. It's like East Coast humidity, and I'm kind of dying. It's very hard to sleep at night because my building doesn't have a lot of great air conditioning, or any at all, really.
That's we complain when it's cold, and we complain when it's hot. I'm loving the newfound freedom that should have never been taken away before, but I'm happy to have some of it back.
I hear that you can't get into a store without an hour wait line, basically, at this point in Toronto.
Really?
Well, you know what? I stopped going to stores years ago, but we've got fantastic weather here. It's not super hot, and the patios are open, so everybody's happy.
So you stopped going to stores, you shop online? Is that
Yes.
the idea?
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
Stores are for suckers. You heard it here first.
When I can find a good tailor online that will measure and see exactly what's going on, for certain things you gotta be in person. But I can see where you're going with that.
How's it going with you in Montreal?
It's hot and then it's cold. I feel like I'm in a Katy Perry song. It's insane. Like, it was 30 degrees at the beginning of the week, and now it's like I woke up this morning and it was 11. Within a 48-hour span, we're not sure what to make of it. But yes, all the terraces are open. People are out and about. We are in green as of this coming Monday. We don't know what to do with this freedom. We can have people over. But it's cool. It's going to be a great summer. It really looks like it's going to be a great summer. Anyways, before we get to our first topic, let us hear from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Atelier Lou Bijouterie in Montreal, Quebec. Atelier Lou specializes in watches and custom design jewelry along with a curated selection of designer jewelry. Visit us online or in person, and Eric Goldberg will help make your jewelry dreams come true. Atelier Lou is offering a promo code for all Bonjour Chai listeners using BON at checkout for 10% off your order at atelierlou.com.
Last week, Tablet magazine published an essay by Soviet refusnik and Israeli statesman Natan Sharansky and Canadian historian Gil Troy called The Un-Jews. In it, they called out Jews who seek to cancel Israel and Jewish peoplehood, and they call them by that very title, The Un-Jews. It has since gathered lots of attention online, to which we are about to add to that. What did you guys make of the arguments put out by the authors?
You know what? I saw the title and I immediately was like, oh, I don't know what this is going to be about. But I was surprised because I actually kind of agreed with a lot of the points that they brought up. I'm not sure if I love the terminology un-Jews because it feels like we're dividing ourselves, which I feel in the Jewish community, that's one thing that I think sets us apart is we do accept Jews of, all different backgrounds, whether it's like a different ethnicity or a different level of religiousness. So I don't, it feels like we're like canceling people within the community, which I don't love. But I do have to say that I've encountered a lot of Jews who are a little bit self-hating. And I don't think that every person who is against Israel necessarily is a self-hating Jew, but there is overlap sometimes. And I do feel sorry for those people because it feels like they're ashamed of their Jewishness, which is what I think the article was trying to say of like, we call ourselves Am Yisrael for a reason. And I think it's something that does need to be discussed, that there are people who want to distance themselves and fit into the larger mass so that they don't get attacked. And I think there is some truth in that. What were your feelings?
You know what? I read this and then I read it again, and I can't help but to fundamentally agree with the premise. Now, I'm someone who looks for solutions in in every problem. That's and we can frame the conversation about what the problem is, but I think what the article fundamentally lacks what are we going to do about it? Because there's no question that that the conflation of it, and I should say that my Jewish identity is very much tied to Zionism. And I think that's, I think that the left and the progressive left has managed to, conflate those issues I should say differentiate between those issues. And I can't help to feel that my Judaism is intrinsically linked to Zionism. But in terms of, why this has happened, and the what we've seen for years ago, 15 years ago on campus has entered the mainstream as the conversation. Why this has happened is because we didn't pay attention, and we didn't pay attention for too long. And I think that our education system and what we put into Hasbara and Israel advocacy, I think that you have Jews that were co-opted by the other side and can't stand up for the things that they believe in because they are not educated on the facts and the issues. So I can't help to agree with the essay. I think I wouldn't use the same words, because as somebody who finds themselves sometimes on the outside of the Orthodox community, but still very strong in terms of my Jewish identity. I'd hate to make that separation between who's Jewish enough and who's not.
Exactly.
But the idea that the progressives have been co-opted by the left to make the distinction between Zionism and anti-Semitism, I think is a very serious issue that we have lost the fight on.
Yeah, so we've gone over this multiple times in past episodes. It's good to hear that at the very least you guys really recognize that this term un-Jews is really it's bordering on offensive.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? It's cutting people out. I was like, how could you say that? And then I started looking at the argument. So right on its face, I had an issue with the term the un-Jews. And I really respect Gil. He is a wonderful scholar. He really is. I know him. I've met him. I've met him a handful of times. He's now living in Israel, so it's hard to, connect with him. And Natan Sharansky is Natan Sharansky. He's a titan. But I started looking at these arguments, and I started finding a lot of flaws within the article itself. Like the idea that, nationalism, right? We're equating this sense of nationalism, right, with this modern form of Judaism, that this is what has become Judaism in the modern era. Nationalisms at all, forget about Jewish nationalism, all nationalisms are not more than 200 years old. So does that mean that for 3,000 years or 2,000 years before that, and since the destruction of the temple where we have Jews as opposed to Israelites, are we going to go and say that, that the hope of Israel was there, but there wasn't really nationalism and there wasn't really a Zionism to understand or to really think of, that we're not going to call these people Jews? We're going to call these people un-Jews because 15th century Jews were not nationalist. They were not Zionist in that same way, right? It's really difficult for me to go and say that we're going to take this thing, which is a modern construct, this idea of nationalism, and turn it into the central point of Judaism when there's so much other things that belong to Judaism. And I'm not saying that Jews shouldn't be nationalist, but there are many Jews, historically, every Jew up until, 200 years ago was not nationalist, was not Zionist. Right, so to go and say that that is un-Jewish, that this is so important, it becomes the central feature. So right away, I had an issue with that. I thought that the examples that they were giving were really, really cherry picked. They're going on about how the Jews that were progressive back in the Roman era and that were picking universal values are all, that they ended up on the wrong side of history. What about, the golden age of Muslim Spain, when Jews were really involved in in universal values like philosophy and science and poetry, and they were very well recognized. They were integrated, and we championed these people, and they didn't come on the wrong side of it because of, you know, the Muslims changing their minds on the Jews. It was the Christians that were taking over the Muslims at the time. Right? Jews in the golden age of Muslim, of the golden age of Islam, were on that side of universalism, and we champion them. We think that it's wonderful. So to go and use that is just, to me, counterexample number one, and that's just one example that I came up with. There's so many other things that they're equating, and then on top of that, right? They go and the line that they say, right? The core line, and I'll read it. Right? We call these critics un-Jews because they believe the only way to fulfill the Jewish mission of saving the world with Jewish values is to undo the ways most actual Jews do Jewishness. Right? And by that, they mean by being Zionist. And there are many, many non-Zionist Jews that we're not aware of, right? Orthodox Jews, by and large, right, are not Zionist, right? If you are a Haredi Jew, and we're not talking about Neturei Karta here, if you are a Haredi Jew, if you are a Chabad Jew, you are not a Zionist. There is a lot of anti-Zionist language in the vast majority of Orthodox discourse, ultra-Orthodox discourse. We don't cut these people out. We champion them. We're like, wonderful, look at the Hasidim, look at Chabad. We love Chabad as a part of the world. They're anti-Zionist at their core in terms of their deep philosophy. They don't talk about it, but that's what they are. Are we cutting those people out also?
I think it's a lot more nuanced than that, because I think we have to go back to the term Zionism, and we talked about this in our episode with Nikki Nashin and the other Concordia rep, that the actual definition of Zionism is us kind of having a safe place in our homeland, and the idea of Zion is where it comes from. So I think there's more to be said. Like, even with ultra-Orthodox Jews, they're not, from my understanding, against the concept of us eventually returning to the land. They just are waiting for Mashiach, the Messiah, to come. So it's not like
that to them is not Zionism. Is the idea that we have the strength and the ability to use our political might to return to the land, and they say no. It's only the Messiah.
I don't know if that's the definition. Maybe some people see it that way, but I think that's the problem. The definition has become something else over the last few decades because of the political atmosphere.
Look, I've got to disagree with you here, and I've often made the argument that our history is certainly, more than longer than the state of Israel has existed, but the construct of having somewhere to go in the current context is a big part of our Jewish identity. Because when there is nowhere to go.
But you're not answering the question here. So first of all, what do we do with the fact that nationalism is only 200 years old?
I don't know if that's true.
Of course.
Well, since we were exiled,
sure,
those are two different.
The modern concept
of
nationalism,
people,
right?
Our whole purpose is to return to the land of Zion, and I think that there's something to be said about, again, referencing that same episode where, and it says this in the essay too. You can criticize the policies of the Israeli government. You can recognize that there is fault, but still be a Zionist because it's a Jewish. That's kind of the whole point of our existence, is to return to our homeland. It's in the Torah everywhere.
I think, Avi, you're talking about the statecraft and the strategy of the modern iteration of Zion.
I'm just referring back to the article. That's what Gil and Natan are talking about.
And I think the idea of Jewish nationalism is far, far, far older than 200 years, and I'm not going to tell the rabbi that, but
I will recognize that we always talk about going back to Israel, but as a scholar, as a wannabe scholar, I'm not even going to call myself a scholar, but as somebody who has read, right, I will be the first one to go and say that I don't think that people really knew what that meant to say that we're going back to Zion, that we're going back to Jerusalem, we're going back to Israel. I don't think people that were saying that ever thought that in their lifetimes or in many other lifetimes, with the exception of the Messiah arriving, that we were going to go and take this land and make it our own again and have our own self-determination without the Messiah there. And that is what a lot of people see is what Zionism is to say, let's do it. Let's take this. We are a nation. And a lot of Jews did not necessarily see themselves as a nation because they saw themselves as scattered. There were Jews in Iran and Iraq, and there were Jews in Italy, and there were Jews in India, and there were Jews all over. And that does not necessarily fit into this idea of what a nation is until about 200 years ago, when you have this idea where religions can start becoming nations in their own right.
I think you're applying a construct that really only exists, sort of in the mid 1600s to how we talk about states and how we talk about statecraft. But that means you're erasing this argument. History, I think, before that, in terms of everybody having some kind of history before we drew the lines on a map and we had governments and multilateral organizations decide who's who in the zoo. It goes well beyond that. We were always, I think, in some way, a Zionist people that searched for nationhood. It's just that it became the modern iteration, as you say, not so long ago.
I'm just stuck on the article itself and saying that he's using the language of this modern nationalism and statecraft, right, to fulfill his argument. And he's basically saying that if you don't fit into this model of what we believe is modern Zionism, right, then you're an un-Jew. And there are many Jews that are then un-Jews that we don't count. Like I said, there are many people that we see all the time. He is essentially saying that Chabad Jews are un-Jews because they do not believe in the Zionism that he is preaching in this article, that they are preaching in this article. And that to me would all of a sudden, it would open people's eyes and like, wait a second, you're not a Zionist like this? You don't believe in the Zionism that I believe in? And there's a lot more Jews than you think. And he's cutting out a significant amount of the Jewish community by doing that. Ilana.
Sure. No. And I think that's the one point that I agree with you on, is that I don't like the terminology, and I think it does erase parts of our nation. I don't know if you'd like me using that word right now, but we are a nation, and I think that is what separates the Jewish people from other groups. We are an ethno-religion, and that's something that's heavily debated by outside people, and I think the more that we try to assimilate, the more that we lose that. And a perfect example, it's funny that you pulled up that quote, because I had a thought on that quote as well, cutting out an essential part of contemporary Jewish identity in order to join the movement of the moment, rebuilding humanity on more equitable and just foundations. So that was a quote close to the one that you said. And the thought that I had was last year, and I might have mentioned this on a previous episode, so I apologize if I'm being redundant, but I got into an argument, a very, very intense argument with someone, a Jewish person online, around anti-Semitism that started turning into a conversation or like a debate around Zionism and anti-Zionism. And to be honest, by the end of that conversation, I was like, can I even trust my fellow Jews? Like, I was already feeling so scared about the rest of the world. And I think that there is something to be said about when it's within the community and there are people who are trying to kind of distance themselves from like our original nationhood, for lack of a better term, that it does become a little bit terrifying. Because what happens if something terrible happens again? That's, God forbid, something as bad as, another giant Holocaust or something. Like, what, those people are not going to be protected. And I think at the end of the day, and I'm sorry to go down this dark rabbit hole, but Hitler did not go up to Jews and ask them, what do you believe? Are you religious? Do you believe that Jews belong in their homeland? That wasn't a question. So we do need to stick together to some degree, even if we don't all agree, Yeah,
so what you're saying is we shouldn't be asking people, are you a Zionist or are you
not
a Zionist?
I don't. I have no problem with people having different opinions, but I do think that there's something.
And Giltroy apparently does have a problem with
Sure.
that.
I wouldn't go.
Well, I'm gonna jump in here and end on this. The threat to I think to the Jewish community and the rise in anti-Semitism all around the world, not just right here in Canada, presents a very real one, and in the sense that this time is different. And we've got to take matters into our own hands. And if we're fighting those in our own community about what it means to be a Jew in this country and against anti-Semitism, then we've got a bigger problem that we need to fix. And I think that is, that is 10 or 15 years of our community trying to go along to get along. And that hasn't worked for us. And that's why we're having this conversation, because of progressive Jews, or the quote unquote progressive Jews, who are questioning, statehood and part of, intrinsically my Jewish identity, then we have a much bigger problem than we ever thought we did.
So you know what the action point is? You were talking about that there's no action point in here. To me, the action point, based on exactly on what you're saying, is we have to have dialogue with the Jews that we don't agree with about Zionism, about how to broaden the definition of Zionism to include people that otherwise are being said you're an anti-Zionist because you're not exactly my form of Zionism. We really need to redefine what it means, because there's a lot of people that say I'm a Zionist, but I think that the Palestinians have a point here, or that they deserve to be treated certain ways, and those people are being cut out as being un-Jews and being anti-Zionist because they don't fit into this very specific model. So I think as long as we're broadening and having this dialogue to start thinking about what it means to be a Zionist, that's an action point for me.
Well, that broadening absolutely can't start at the point where you have progressive Jews calling Israel an apartheid state. It has to stop. It has to start at a place where you can have a conversation. You just like on the other side of the world, in order to have peace, you need a partner for peace. And 100%. I think that there are many in the progressive left that are not partners.
There are many in the progressive right that are dictating what that means, and we have to look at the broad middle of that bell curve and say, let's all sit down and talk, and let's cut out the extremes on both sides and say that's not acceptable and that's not acceptable, and let's sit down and figure out what this means. June 24th marks Saint Jean-Baptiste Day in Quebec, or as it has become known in recent years as La Fête Nationale, the national holiday. It has become a day to celebrate French-Canadian heritage, culture, and nationalism. Jews have long been part of Quebec society, and with us to discuss this rich history and the relationship between Quebec Jewry and Quebec nationalism is Pierre Anctil. Pierre is a professor of history at the University of Ottawa and is one of the foremost experts of the history of Jews in Montreal, in Quebec. Of course, right behind, my father. Pierre, welcome.
Thank you, Avi.
Can you tell us... Can you start by telling us a bit about the Jewish community in Quebec before and during the Quiet Revolution, what their relationship was to the Quebec establishment at the time?
Well, you have to remember that the Quiet Revolution is basically 60 years ago. At the time, the Sephardim had not been established. They had not arrived or been established in Montreal. So most of the Jews in the early 1960s were Ashkenazim from Eastern Europe who had transferred to English. That first generation of Anglophone mother tongue Jews in Montreal appeared in the 60s. And it was a difficult relationship, not so much because of tension or disagreements, but for lack of contact. You have a neighbor and you don't know him, you don't meet him often, you don't speak his language, you don't pray with him. And Montreal was very compartmentalized, so that was the problem essentially, is Jews and French Canadians were looking for ways to speak to each other, and they began to do so in the early 60s.
What was the relationship like in that time? Was it cordial? I know that there was always tension between the Quebec, the Québécois and the Anglophones. Were the Jews perceived as Anglophone, or were they really another? Were they, as I like to say, a third solitude?
Well, the background, of course, was the tension, real tension, or disagreements, or I would say even further political wrangling over who would control Montreal between Anglo-British and Franco-Catholic. So Jews were caught in between. They were not more than 6% of the population at the time of Montreal. So the basis was actually too small demographically to enter and modify the perceptions of the two dominant groups. The relations, it's very interesting. It has changed a great deal also. The relations between Jews and French Canadians at the basic level was good. They would meet in stores, they would work together, they would meet in parks. because most of the Jews were leaving at the time Plateau Mont-Royal, moving west. And it's the elite, the more established Catholic-leaning, often conservative intellectuals who found it difficult to come to terms with Jews, not because they were Anglophones, but because they were not Christians. So that's a big difference between, having a relationship with Anglo-British people who were Christians and who were dominant politically, and having relations with Jews that you had much less in common with at the time.
You were quite active in the Dialogue Saint-Urbain association that promoted better understanding between the Jewish community and the Francophone community in Quebec. So what work do you feel still needs to be done to bridge that gap between these two communities for a more peaceful coexistence?
Well, much has been accomplished. First of all, the Jewish community has become bilingual. The solution was, Jews realized at one point that they had to come to terms with Quebec society in Montreal for all kinds of reasons. And so they added French to the already existing Anglophone structures. They welcomed the Sephardim, who were also interested in having services in French within the Jewish community, and that made a huge difference. So I think today, people in the younger generations are fluently bilingual. There's very few exceptions. There's always exceptions. And among Francophones also, there's a much greater proportion of people who speak English. So there's more comfort. And then I think the source of tension was the sovereignist movement. Jews did not understand really where that was going, and they feared that they would be second-class citizens or not offered the same advantages or the same rights or the equal treatment. And that has receded on the horizon much after the second referendum, which took place in 1995. It's no longer an issue that is, immediate. I'm not saying it's gone, but it's not going to be, there won't be another referendum, and the next election will not be about sovereignty. Not saying Quebec has ceased to be a place which is, different, as we can easily understand when watching the debates in Ottawa today. But it's not a head-on collision anymore. So that has made a difference as well.
Professor, I want to ask you, because as somebody who is outside of Quebec, who has never lived in Quebec, who is a Jew from Toronto, you talk about the history of the Jewish community integrating into Quebec, and from the outside vantage point, I don't see that. Everything that I read suggests that there is heads butting between the Jewish community on questions of religious symbolism and all of those things. So take off the historian hat and tell me that I'm wrong in terms of what I'm seeing from the outside here.
Yes, you are wrong, because I'm not saying this to displease you or to be offensive, but I live in French. I see this place in French, and I can live in English as well, as you can hear now. And when I read the French press, or I'm at UQAM today, the French-speaking university, I don't see what you're describing at all. When Avi and I meet, we speak French fluently.
Well, we speak Yiddish, actually.
Yeah, that's true. I wasn't going to go into this. But we don't even think about it. And it's natural. So often what happens seen from Toronto, first of all, is that there's a lingering, I would say, negative perception that Jews have picked up. The origins of this is in the Anglo-British perception of French Canada. And you don't read the French press. You don't read what's going on in French. So I think Avi would agree, in the last 20 years, there's been quite a bit of progress. Mind you, again, that you have to read more in French. The community that raises the most concerns is no longer the Jews. It's the Muslims. If you read Le Journal de Montréal, you will see that there's suspicion. What we witnessed 50 years ago vis-à-vis the Jews is now vis-à-vis the Muslims. And there are frequent blurbs or attacks or all kinds of insinuations against Muslims, Arabs, Muslims in Montreal, and not against Jews at the moment. The only situation which is raised, and that's worldwide, of course, concerns is the recent Gaza attacks in Israel. But that's universal, it's not just here in Canada. So I would say that you have to really plunge into the French world to get a sense of that they're changing pace.
I want to focus on that a second, or actually bring out a little wider lens, because it's fascinating to me that the Jews could have latched on, or there could have been a moment, right, 60 years ago, as we said, in the early days, when there was this recognition for sovereignty as being akin to being and Zionism was at its peak at the time, right? There could have been a close association and say, we are in this at the same way. We are looking for different lands, but we are in this sort of fight together. And that didn't happen. And I feel like what ended up happening is that the Quebecois sovereignists then ultimately saw the Jews or the Zionists not as the people looking for their own land, but the Palestinians, the underdogs within that fight at the time, and they started associating the same way that the Quebecois associate with the Basque and other minority Catalan, those sovereignist movements, right? They ended up fixating on the Palestinians, and there was a moment that was really missed in terms of rapprochement with the Jewish and the Quebecois communities, because there was no thought to say we do the same thing. We're just looking, and it's the same blue and white flag, just different configurations.
Yeah, and the Quebec flag is 1948.
Yes. So can you comment on that a bit? Think about the two types of nationalisms that are going on here.
Yeah. Well, it's very complex. I see a dual approach in the Jewish community in Montreal. Often, at least for a while, we go back at least to World War II. In Canada, the Jews will defend Canadian unity because they're concerned that in a Quebec sovereign country, maybe their rights will not be respected as strongly, although that I doubt that kind of inquietude, wariness is valid, but you can raise it. It's so they will tend to take the sides of federalism in Canada and not Quebec. I'm not saying everyone. I'm not saying that's been the general trend. When it comes to Israel, which is itself a form of nationalism, of course, then they switch. They go from being Federalists in Canada to being Zionists in the Middle East. Marceau has made that comment, and René Lévesque, by the way, did also. René Lévesque spoke to Jewish audiences, both during the referendums and before, and he said, what we have in mind is what Israel has done. It didn't register at the time. We're speaking of the 70s and 80s. He didn't say this to non-Jewish audiences, but he said it to Jewish audiences. We have, accounts of this being said in synagogues. It's written. So there's basically this complexity that when Jews are in Canada, they will side with federalism, even Quebec Jews, and you can see it with the current debates on the recent Law 96, which the CAQ has introduced regarding, the refranchisation of certain elements. It's not to be discussed here, so we don't come to terms on this easily, as perhaps we should. It's not easy to introduce the issue of Palestine and Israel and the debate on Quebec, Canada, And there's a huge difference in the history of Jews in Europe and what it produced. It produced Zionism and then the Holocaust and the violent situation in the Middle East and the situation of French Canadians, which is not the same at all. It's very difficult to make the point today that French Canadians are alienated, oppressed, second-class citizens. It no longer appears to be a valid argument as it was during the Quiet Revolution.
For sure. I'm curious, taking it back a few steps, you mentioned that the main distinction between the two communities was language. But if you look at something like Bill 21, the secularism bill, I think that might have alienated a lot of practicing Jewish people. So based on your extensive research on the Jewish community in Quebec, what do you believe the future of Quebec Jewry looks like based on these types of bills and these types of laws? Because as you said, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of people did go away because they were worried about being treated differently. And now this is a whole other level.
Well, they did go away because also Toronto was becoming more dynamic economically than Quebec. And that's often forgotten in the equation. I think most Jews who left for Toronto were actually looking for better opportunities and better jobs, simply, and they did like other Anglophones.
I'm going to break in a second to sidebar on that. Do you really think that had there not been Bill 101, for example, you wouldn't have this mass exodus down the 401?
The exodus took place.
That would have happened anyway? Sorry, that's what you're saying?
It took place earlier. It took place before.
But it was in the air. I mean, that was...
But there's clear signs in the 50s and 60s that Toronto was gaining ground and was taking over and becoming the center of the economy in Canada. And what the PQ did afterwards was simply conform and confirm it. I think Jews could adapt, and they did, and those who remained did adapt well. And Bill 101 was not an anti-Jewish law. It was a law which more broadly...
No, but it was going to make things difficult for, if you already have a 2-language school, to have a 3-language school, but which, like you said, we've adapted. My daughter, who is American, was French valedictorian.
Yeah. So let's go back to the question by Ilana. Basically... I think the future is that I think the large part, the most difficult part is done. The most complex period and tense was during the Quiet Revolution of the 60s, and especially during the period when the PQ took over in 76, moved in a language law. By the way, the federal government also moved in language laws and are still discussing language laws, so it's nothing exceptional. And when there was uncertainty as to where this was all going. Now we're in 2021, and we have an ability to look back and say, well, in the last 20 or 30 years, the situation has not worsened. I would say it has improved. Quite interestingly, and I'd say, it has, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but the situation of the last 20 years or 30 years has produced a new identity for Montreal Jews, different from the identity of Toronto Jews or New York Jews. First of all, because if you live in Montreal, you're going to be bilingual. It seems to be a natural reaction. It's not necessarily a legal impediment forcing you to do it. And you're going to resonate differently. Maybe Avi will be sensitive to this, but when you look at figures...
Ilana grew up in Montreal.
Yeah, I can be like the poster child for this because I'm in my late 20s, so I lived out the last number of years in Montreal. I no longer live in Quebec, but I did grow up there, and I've only been in BC for the last 5 years of my life.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if you look at figures for religious observance, for synagogue attendance, and for enrolling your children in Jewish schools where they get Jewish education, Montreal has the highest percentage in North America, ahead of Toronto, and way ahead of American numbers.
Well, that's because the Quebec government does subsidize a lot of the day school.
In part, but it's also because being in a dual environment, French and English, leaves more room for Jews to maneuver on their own ground. As in Toronto, and especially in the US, it's more difficult to define Jewishness outside of the mainstream. Here, quite frankly, there's no majority in Montreal. Each group, French and English, has its own sphere, its own interest, its own power base, and other groups are connected to this in different ways. But it's possible. I think it's easier to forge a third avenue and be Jewish in that environment. That I think the figures tend to prove it. So the future is I don't think Jews are any longer the object of systematic obsessive attention on the part of French Canadians. That was the case in the 30s and 40s. They're no longer shut out from the mainstream French world, and they are no longer confronted with issues that are very demanding, such as Declaration of Independence the next day. We still have a lot to do. I reject entirely Law 21 personally. I think it's a breach of basic rights, and it's going to go to court, and we'll see what it does. But it hasn't. I don't think it has affected the Jewish community immediately and directly.
Probably because a lot of these Jewish schools don't have the rule applying to them, right?
Well, look, I suspect that the reason why Jews aren't fighting more forcefully or as a large community is because many Jews don't think that the law applies to them, that they're escaping from it. There are not many Jewish public servants, not many Jewish police officers, not many Jews in the public school system who are covering their hair. And they're like, you know what, we're going to skate on this one. We're just going to let it slide, and we're going to be quiet and not get in the way of, something which, that's what I suspect.
I've written an op-ed in Le Devoir arguing that the measure was designed for Muslim women specifically. And for that reason, I don't see that it affects the Jewish community very seriously, but it does affect the Muslim community much more, and that's unjust and unfair completely. And it goes back to what I said. The focus now is on Muslims.
So I do think that you're right in the sense that we are carving out, and we have this identity as Montreal Jews that is unique, and I champion it, and I think it's wonderful. I do think, based as an extension of what you're saying, that one of the biggest mistakes that the Jewish community made was this fear, right, in the late 70s, early 80s, that led to this mass exodus. Because for a lot of people, you're right that there was there was that opportunities that were happening in Toronto, but I do think that, our loss ends up being Melissa's gain. You have a wonderful, huge Jewish community, and that community would have learned to adapt in Montreal, and they would have kept the community strong and richer, and we would not have these, questions over, our demographics and our shrinking demographics on a regular basis, if not for that mass exodus during that short period of time when, this was becoming a real thing.
Well, there's also the issue that I think the evolution is easier to predict for the next 20 years than it was during the 70s. Quebec has become much more diverse in French, which is another factor. In the 60s, Quebec was not diverse in French. It was diverse in English only. Now, with Bill 101, the children of immigrants must go to French language schools, and that has transformed Quebec society enormously. And that benefited Jews as well, because, in the 30s, it was French Canadians, English Canadians, and Jews, period. And then were added Italians and Greeks during the referendum. But today, we're looking at a myriad of different communities, different colors, different origins, different religion, all in French. And so we won't go back to that period when Jews were singled out as the source of diversity and the source of problems. I don't think so.
Well, that's let's be honest. That was as far as recent as 1995, right? The most famous comment. Tomorrow, Saint Jean Baptiste, I'm going to be out wearing my T-shirt saying "ethnic without money."
Oh, that.
Here, that's me, right? Jacques Parizeau calls the Jews, it doesn't call them out by name, it says the ethnics with money, but that's what we were. We were the ethnics that were moneyed. But I think you are right that we are, that is moving away and that the diversity in the French community is getting huge. One last question, just to wrap it up. I'm always amazed by the fact, not because it was so weird to think about and so wrong, but because Jews were always on the federalism side, tended to be seen as that. But there were always Jews in the separatist movement and the sovereigntist sides. Who were just point out quickly some of the notable ones, and what was their approach to saying, I'm Jewish, but I believe in this cause?
Well, I forget the first name, but Levine, as recently when Legault was a Péquiste, so it's 20 years ago, was named Minister of Health under Legault. This was, I think it was early 2002. And he wasn't elected, and he resigned. And there are other famous names. Salomon Cohen ran for the PQ. And I'm not saying a fair share of Jews vote for the PQ, but besides, it's pointless. The vote belongs to individuals. It doesn't belong to communities or groups, or so we each vote according to our conscience. And I think we have to acknowledge that yes, Jews tend to be more federalist or vote more liberal, but it's not something that we have to discuss. The result are not calculated according to who votes for which community, but for parties and number of seats. That's all.
Yes. Are there going to be, this is a totally out of left field, are you working on any new translations from Yiddish into of the arts world that we can work on? For those of you who don't know, Pierre actually translated some of the most famous works of Michel Tremblay for the stage into Yiddish for the Yiddish Theatre in Montreal. What's on the horizon for the Yiddish-Québécois intersection?
I'm exploring the editorials of the Canada Radler, the Yiddish newspaper for the 30s. There was a daily, and so each day the Canada Radler had 2 or 3 editorials. So I'm exploring those who are written about French Canada. And I made very interesting discoveries. First of all, that the main publisher, main writer, we think it was Israel Rabinovich, read French fluently. And he translated from French to Yiddish certain passages in Le Devoir editorials, and he took the side of French Canadians against Orangists and against Anglo-British people who were not willing to allow French education in Ontario or the other places in the country. So there was a great deal of dialogue and thinking about the relationship, but, as you know, Avi, in Yiddish. So what are we going to do with this today unless we translate it? And even at the time, what French Canadian could read Yiddish? So it's a multi-layered, multi-language community, and it takes time to decipher all the various elements and factions and potentialities. We should do more to learn each other's history. In 2017, I published Histoire des Juifs du Québec in French, so it's like Yiddish for the Toronto Jews. But it's coming out in English this fall, History of the Jews in Quebec. So I hope that we can discuss more our common history and prospects and possibilities. And I think, Avi, you'll agree with me that there's a lot to be shared as groups that are in the minority, French Canadians in Canada or the continent, and Jews in the diaspora. And there's a lot in terms of, as Les Belles Sœurs in Yiddish showed, there's a lot in terms of emotion and in terms of sharing a difficult history.
Pierre, you'll be happy to know that this Jew from Toronto is a fluent French speaker.
Ah, merveilleux, je suis très content d'apprendre ça. Tu vois, ça ne serait jamais arrivé à la génération précédente. Would your parents have learned fluent French
No,
and
they
raised
were
you?
smart enough to put me in French school here.
Ah,
She's only learnt it so that she could become a federal candidate for government, which she will
It
be
was
an MP.
it was an
soon
early
enough.
start for me.
no, but that's a new phenomena, and it's required that we know each other's language. Language is so important for French Canadians and Quebecois, and we think that human rights legislation is also important for Jews. So and French Canadians, we have a lot in common. We can learn about the position that we held each vis-a-vis the other in history and in
Yeah.
the future.
I think that would be amazing for more French Canadians to learn more about the Jewish history in Quebec, because I think
Yeah.
that's the part that becomes unbalanced. Having been through the system, we learn so much about the French Canadian side, and you don't see as much of that in the curriculum. But then again, if you look at the famous foods of Montreal, it's Jewish and French Canadian: poutine, bagels, lox, and smoke meat.
Look, I spent my childhood going to a Steinberg every week to buy food in Quebec City.
Absolutely.
Everyone knew that Steinberg wasn't a French Canadian.
Yeah. Well, Pierre, thank you so much. When the book comes out in English, we should have you on again to talk more about these issues and questions. It will be an honor to have you again. Thank you so much for taking the time. Have you translated Jean du Pays back into Yiddish yet? Can you sing us out with a couple of bars? No?
Not yet. If you want to, we can do that.
We'll make it work. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Let's move on to our nachas of the week, where we'd like to highlight something which has come across our radar and given us some nachas as Jewish Canadians. Melissa, what's your nachas of the week?
Okay, if you're in Toronto, you might have seen this. It has just started, and I haven't seen this kind of advocacy in a long time from any members of the community. But we've got an ad campaign right now at 80 or 90 places around the cities on like bus shelters and things like that, and it's called the No Hate Against Jews campaign, and it is a small group of grassroots members of a newly found group that have just said enough is enough. We're going to take matters into our own hands, and we're going to put out this campaign. And there isn't a bunch of different logos on the bottom. There's just a bunch of people that want to raise awareness about the rise in anti-Semitism to be paid attention to. And I can't help to shep nachas for them.
That is nachas. Alana, what's your nachas?
I made a rainbow challah for Pride, and it was pretty awesome. So we had an event through Moishe House that was facilitated by a Toronto Jew. You can follow her on Instagram at All My Bread Friends. Her name is Pearl, and she taught us how to individually dye each strand, and it was 6 braided. It was hard, and put it all together. And then I learned that some people make all these crazy types of challahs, like ones where you can fill it with like s'mores, like chocolate and marshmallow. Or she was like, if you're having a dairy Shabbat, you could fill it with cheese. I was like, whoa, my mind is blown. So you can check out all of her baking on her Instagram.
I had a friend that every year used to do this dinner called Fleischfest, where every item on the menu had to have meat in it. Right, the side dishes, everything. Mincemeat pies for dessert.
Give this guy an order of Canada.
Yeah, I should. And so the challah always was, like, instead of a raisin challah, it was studded with like chunks of salami.
Interesting.
So yeah, shout out to Jeremy and his Fleischfest every year. My nachas has been a very beautiful one. Over the past 3 weeks, I have been a coach for this amazing program run by the JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, called the Changemakers. I don't know if you've seen ads for it or been around. It's basically for people in the 19 to 25 age bracket, roughly people that are self-identified as future changemakers in the community. I've been a coach for the Canadian cohort. Now, of course, the Canadian cohort does not include any of the Torontonians. They have their own cohort. So they have like 20, and we got like 6 Canadians from the rest of Canada. It has been an amazing experience being a part of their lives and being part of their journey as they think about what it means to be a change maker. So to the rest of Canada, change makers, right? Leora, Nathan, Jordan, Yuvi, Brennan, and Rachel, I salute you and I salute the change that you will make for the future of the communities. Good luck on making change in Canada. And for those of you who want to hear more about it, go look up Changemakers. There's another July cohort coming up. I think it's too late to sign up for that one, but they're going to be doing more in the future. Changemakers, let's make change. For today's Rabbinic Voice, we go to Rabbi Boris Dolan of Congregation Dorshei Emet in Montreal, Quebec.
If I was going to name an all-purpose song to open any Shabbat service or program, it would be Ma Tovu. Short and sweet, the words of this song remind us of one of the core reasons we have community. Ma Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael. How good are your tents, your sanctuaries, Israel. Anytime we gather, before we pray, we sing, we discuss, we learn, we argue, we first acknowledge the beautiful holy space that we're creating together. And I've always found it interesting that these words which have become such a core part of our religious lives, those words which bless our community, our Jewish community, were said by Bilam, a non-Jewish magician prophet who's sent by Balak, king of Moab, to curse the Israelites. Clearly, his plan doesn't work out as expected. And as he's standing on top of a hill overlooking the Israelite encampment, all he can do is bless. And these words of a non-Jew, they've become so important that we find them printed down for eternity in our most Jewish of texts, our Torah and our Siddur, our prayer book. The lesson is clear. Our opening blessing for community, for Jewish community, reminds us that we need each other. We need the community of those close to us, those who share our communal story, our values, and our ways of understanding the world. But we also need to step out and gain inspiration from others beyond our inner circle. And I know that in some ways this is a common sense reminder, but it is one that I think more of our leaders and all of us need to hear. The world is much smaller when we shut off our minds from those who are different than us, when we build walls or when we stay too long in our inner circles. We lose sight of the diversity of people, opinions, and ways of being. Without the perspective of difference, we lose the opportunity to see the beauty in others. We lose the vision and the openness. So stepping beyond the walls of the sanctuaries we built, it can be difficult. To encounter others who are different than us, sometimes it does take real effort. To have a conversation about politics, religion, Israel, values, hockey. It forces us to expand our ideas and our identity in ways that are not always easy. But if we do this with kavanah, with commitment, it makes us and our communities even stronger. But we can do this. We can't solve all of the brokenness in the world just by encountering those who are most different than us. If this pandemic, this strange and challenging year and a half, has taught us anything, it can help us understand the ways that we are so deeply connected with each other. So let us continue to strengthen the community we have, but sometimes leave to take the journeys to see and encounter places, ideas, and people who are not like us. We can start by opening our eyes to see the beauty of all that we encounter, by doing our best to bless what we share and honoring what makes us different.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for Thursday, June 24th. Our producer is Michael Fraiman. Technical production is by Andre Goulet. Our music is by Socalled. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave a comment and a rating on the platform of your choice and let us know what you think about our discussions on the CJN Lounge on Facebook. I'm Avi Finegold.
I'm Melissa Lantsman.
And I'm Ilana Zackon.